So you've bought and planted your climbing rose, but now you've realized that it's only flowering at the very top. What's the problem? What can you do to improve it? That's what we're going to cover in today's video from Green Tips Garden. So what's the difference between a climbing rose and a rambling rose? A climbing rose has a few vigorous stems which originate from the crown of the plant that allow you to train it over a structure or against a wall. A climbing rose will have larger flowers and will often repeat flower throughout the season, whereas a rambling rose will have numerous vigorous whippy stems and will cover a large area. It's very vigorous. It will be covered in a multitude of blossoms in one large flowery show. So now you know the difference between a climber and a rambler. And in today's video, we're going to discuss how to train your climbing rose. There are three things that we're going to cover in today's video: deadheading, feeding and mulching, pruning and training. Number one, deadheading. This means removing the spent flower heads. Now you wouldn't want to do this if you're keeping your rose because it has ornamental rose hips, or those seed pods that develop towards autumn. Deadheading is a simple process and it encourages flowering in a number of ways. First of all, by snapping off the seed head, it makes the plant just look better because you don't have those brown fading blossoms. But also it means that the plant doesn't invest energy in producing seeds. And thirdly, that means that the energy that was going to go towards making seed will now get focused into producing more flowers as the plant attempts to produce seed. All you have to do is either just snap off the seed head or the spent flower bloom, or you can use some sharp secateurs to cut the blossom off. You'll notice that some roses bloom in a cluster rather than individual flowers. So maybe you'll find that these flower one after the other. So you can just snip off the individual blooms as they fade, and once the entire cluster has finished flowering, just take that cluster back to the first set of true leaves, as in leaves that look like the rest of the plant. Just snip that off and then you've removed that flower cluster. Oh! Step number two, feeding and mulching. Roses do well in a variety of conditions, but will do better in soil that is free draining but yet holds on or retains moisture. This can be accomplished in everyday terms by simply incorporating plenty of organic matter into the soil. In addition, a well-fed rose will bloom in abundance and be more resilient to pests and diseases. In March to early April, you can apply a granular feed to the rose, which will gradually break down in the soil and provide food for the plant over an extended period. Or alternatively, you could use a liquid feed. I use tomato food every 1 or 2 weeks, diluted. Now, the nutrients in the tomato feed, or the chemicals in the tomato feed, are just nutrients that promote flowering in the plant. So your rose plant is not going to produce tomatoes, have no fear. It's just plant food and does a really great job. And you can find a link to that food that I use in my comment section below. Then once you've watered and fed your rose, the next step is to mulch it. Now this helps the soil around the rose to retain the moisture and also suppress weeds. You could use garden compost, which is fine, or you could use well-rotted manure. Now the reason it needs to be well-rotted is that if you apply this around the roots of a rose, the decomposition of the manure, which is still fresh, will burn the roots. So obviously make sure it's well-rotted. You need to apply a mulch to the surface around the rose to about 1 or 2 inches and cover out to the extent of the canopy of the rose. But just a reminder, don't put the mulch right up to the collar or the bark or stem of the rose, as this could encourage rot and other problems. Number 3, pruning and training. Maybe you've noticed, as we've mentioned, that your climbing rose is flowering just at the top. Climbers do this in nature as it would indicate that they've reached the top of the plant that they're climbing through and they can go no further. And so as their stems begin to arch over, they begin to flower because they now understand that they're open to pollinators and animals that would collect and disperse their seeds after they've flowered. So pruning and training is something that should be carried out in autumn to early spring. This is a good time, especially to carry out your pruning and training of climbing roses, because the main canes are still flexible. So the main canes are the ones that spring out from the crown of the plant, and if possible, you only want to cut these back by about a third when you are pruning and training. An exception to this is if the canes have become old and tired, and you can tell that from the fact that the bark on them is grey and flaky and loose. They'll be about 5 years old, they're not producing any flowering laterals, and you can do renewal pruning, cutting these back to 12 inches or 30 centimetres. Coming out of the main canes are the laterals, and these can be taken back to about 2 or 4 inches. This is obviously where we're talking about standard pruning, not renewal pruning. So you've cut your main cane back by 1/3, and now these laterals, the ones that come off of the main canes, by 2 to 4 inches. So you've now tidied up all of the main canes and laterals on the main plant. It's therefore easier to see what you have, the skeleton of the plant, and now it's easy to begin tying in those stems. You need to tie in the stems, and as you do so, don't tie them tightly against the structure that you're training them against, but tie them in loosely so they've got space to grow. Now, regarding training, you could use a method called pillaring, where you wrap the main canes around a post or obelisk or column in a spiral manner. Alternatively, you could try pegging if you are not using a structure and have plenty of room. This is where you take the canes and arch and pin them, either arching them and pulling them back into the crown if you have enough flexibility, or pegging them further out or even up and over the plant to peg over onto the other side of the crown. Since you peg down the growing tip of these main canes, there'll be no further extension growth, but the laterals will be stimulated to grow, and these are the ones that will produce the flowers. It's helpful to understand a little bit about the chemical process that's happening within the plant. Now, this is controlled by hormones, and the one when you bend the stems, the main canes down, has an impact on the hormone called auxin and its apical dominance. This is produced, or this auxin is produced at the tip and travels down the stem via gravity. And what it does, it inhibits the side shoots from developing from the main canes. These side shoots grow into lateral stems, and these are the ones that we actually want to grow as they produce the flowers. So pruning and training, as we mentioned, mimic nature, and by bending over the canes that grow from the base from between 45 degrees up to 90 degrees, you make the plant think that it's reached the top of the canopy. This inhibits the auxin and allows a hormone called cytokinin that travels up from the roots. Now this stimulates or breaks the dormancy on the side shoots. This hormone also stimulates flower production. However, just bear in mind that if you do bend the tips down to 90 degrees, this will inhibit the auxin so much that the tip will stop growing. So if you want the stem to continue extending, you want extension growth, remember to leave a section of the end, maybe a foot 15-20 centimeters free, pointing upwards, so that the auxin continues to stimulate that extension growth. If you've enjoyed this video, click the like button. And also, I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscriptions, which will help monetize this YouTube channel with YouTube. So I'd really appreciate it if you'd click the subscribe button. And don't forget lastly to click the bell if you'd like to be notified of my next post. Let me know how you've got on in the comment section below, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Green Tips Garden.